thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's the subtext of our talk today is how does obscure academic work become relevant? Trust me, we didn't want this, we didn't expect it, and it's kind of been a surprise and much more pleasant surprise than we expected. So, just to give you a little bit of background on how sort of what A data is and where we're coming from. As noted, this is a partnership between two universities, College of William and Mary, Brigham Young University, and Development Gateway, which is a non-governmental organization in Washington, D.C. specializing in information on foreign aid. It was originally part of the World Bank, and then it was spun off into an independent organization that exists now apart from the The idea is, it's an ambitious goal. We want to capture the universe of foreign aid. We want to get it all. So far, that has been only development assistance from governments and intergovernmental organizations like the World Bank. The eventual plan is to include private aid, and we now are in the final processes of including aid from the Gates Foundation, the largest foundation, and several other foundations have contacted us and would like to include their information in our database. Eventually, of course, we want to get it all, right? So we want to get, military aid and all the other aid we can imagine or haven't yet imagined. But so far, this is government aid, either directly in bilateral gifts to countries, usually in the form of grants, or in multilateral loans and grants to countries from international organizations. Because both College of William and Mary and Brigham Young University are predominantly undergraduate institutions, this is a great way to get students involved and engaged in research, and they really have been the engine of all of this. So we've taken information from tens of thousands of projects and made it much more user to people, and that's all been the work of diligent and very intelligent undergraduates. You see, we've worked with lots of different organizations. The National Science Foundation, the Gates and Hewlett Foundations, both have sponsored our work. Of course, we're working now with you all here at the CCAPS project. The World Bank, a recent partner, especially with the georeferencing project, which we'll talk to you about in just a moment. So this is the biography or the genealogy of this is always interesting because where does this stuff come from? This is an undergraduate honors thesis. This is how it began. So my colleague and another co-author of Professor Weaver's and I years ago, in the early part of the 2000s, started a project where we're gathering information on the World Bank, which eventually spread to the other regional development banks in Asia and Latin America. Gathering that information, and at the same time, this very enterprising undergraduate, Brad Park, came to Professor Tierney and to two of Professor Tierney's colleagues and said, I want to do a project on environmental aid. And they said, that sounds like a great idea, sounds like a great project. And so we started looking for information on foreign aid. And there was a fairly detailed database from the OECD, the Club of Rich Countries, that kept track of their own aid. And beyond that, there was nothing. Right? Nothing was systematically gathered. So, the total people keep talking about is $2.3 trillion in foreign aid, but no one was really sure because no one kept track of it all. How do you lose track of trillions of dollars? I guess there's so many, but no one had kept track of it all, and so this undergraduate at William and Mary decided to start keeping track of it all. Realized it was a much bigger project than he anticipated, but he's a pretty ambitious guy, and so with help from the National Science Foundation, like later the Gates and Hewlett Foundation, his vision became a reality, and he's also been able to write 2 books from the project. While he was working for the Millennium Challenge Corporation, one of their project managers. So while he was in Washington, so Brad graduates, he gets the data for the book, we put it together, we get the National Science Foundation grant, we get a lot of information together. While he was working in Washington, D.C., he started talking about this project. At the time it was called PLAD, Project Level Aid. And people say, well, that would be pretty useful, right? That information would be pretty useful. We have no idea what other agencies are doing in the world. It would be nice to be able to know. And so they had us come to the White House to give a presentation, not the White House, but the White House complex. We gave a presentation there to a bunch of people from around the government, and they were really interested, deeply interested. And this caught us by surprise. We're a bunch of professors, right? We wanted data for our research, right? We had no thought that it might be relevant, but they were very interested. And of course, when the Gates Meal Foundation decided to sponsor the initiative, they were really interested in making this very useful. And it turns out that knowing what all the other agencies are doing for any given agency is really helpful, right? You can coordinate better on the ground. You can specialize. We'd love to see that at some point. Every agency seems to do everything instead of some focusing on what they're best at, and leaving the rest for others that are good at it. One of the surprising things, and this comes out of some research that I've been doing lately with Professor Tierney and two of our students, former students now at Harvard in the doctoral program. We learned, and we think there's probably more here than just what we've learned so far, is that aid transparency, so the amount of information that's known about given projects, may actually have pretty big effects in the countries that receive the aid, up to and including reducing the corruption in those countries. In fact, we see a significant relationship between the transparency of the aid, just how many cells in the row is about that project is filled in, right? And the overall corruption scores done by Transparency International and others in those countries. The more that's known, the less the corruption. It surprises to a certain degree. I mean, probably shouldn't have, but it seems like a significant relationship, and there's probably more there. Lots of other work has been done that's shown that the more that's known, the less wiggle room there is for sort of bad things to happen. So more transparency, of course, better planning and coordination, some of our sort of more distant partners like Publish What You Fund and the One campaign, who are pretty closely related to Bono's big project on foreign aid. They're able to use this information to hold governments and other aid agencies accountable, and hopefully create better foreign aid and beyond that. So here's kind of what we do. We gather information on at what's called the project level. So one of the things that the OECD, the rich countries club does is gather information in the aggregate, sort of how much money goes from which government to which recipient. But what we're interested in is each individual project, because when you know what individual projects are, you can actually categorize them in different ways. So you can learn, what this education aid overall, or types of education aid, say for primary education, that have an effect on things like primary enrollment rates. Right? I mean, so if you disaggregate the aid by sector or subsector, you might have a better sense of the specific effects of that aid. So, but you can't do that with aggregates, right? You have to actually start from the most basic unit, which has typically been the project, and build up from there. So we start at the project level, and of course we want to do all of the conventional and traditional donors, which would include those rich countries and the multilateral institutions that they sponsor, like the World Bank. But there's also a bunch of other donors that no one knows anything about. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, South Korea, China, right? These are all fairly sizable donors. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait are about the size of Finland in terms of how much foreign aid they give. And that's just the official stuff we know about. China is potentially much larger, and certainly will become much larger over time. And so we've gathered information on those donors. Lots of multilateral organizations, 40 or so, give aid, but none of them, with a few exceptions were tracked by the official agencies. Remember that $2.3 trillion we talked about? It's actually $4.2 trillion. And so almost half of the aid money, which had never been tracked before, was mostly from those multilateral organizations, the World Bank, the IMF, International Monetary Fund being the largest. But that was untracked. That was not put together. I mean, each of the individual agencies track their own money, and they publish reports, responsibly every year. But no one has bothered to actually put it all on one place, so it can actually be compared with the other data and made comparable to the other data. Part of that, of course, is that the OECD does careful. All governments reports to the OECD do careful reporting of specific categories where they give the aid. They have sector coding. Of course, those don't exist for the multilateral organizations. So we, with our army of undergraduates, William & Mary and BYU, had to read each project description carefully and assign it to those categories in a consistent way, like the OECD did. It turned out that it was hard to do, so we had to reorganize their categorization scheme to make it more specific and detailed. So the non-bank donors, the multilaterals, and we also want more information on the project. If you look at, some of you are familiar a little bit with the OECD information, the information they have is really sort of sketchy. Right? And very often very brief description, maybe a few words in a title or a short description. That's insufficient, and so we need more than that. So here's where we're going. These are all things we're working on. You can ask about any of these, specific things, if you'd like. Lots of research projects, focused on effectiveness, and lots of other things going forward that ought to have applications for people in the aid world who are practicing foreign aid. Here's an example of sort of the visualizations we can get. This is a sectoral dashboard for health. Shows you the overall amount of dollars, in projects in the health sector, and sort of how they changed over time, which donors are important. Lots of ways you can break this out, and different ways of doing this. These are still kind of in prototype, but you can see that it's much more useful and sort of accessible information that way. A project we're doing in Uganda this summer. We're trying to figure out what motivates citizens to actually give more information about the aid projects in their neighborhoods. So, an example: a concerned citizen sent us a picture of an orange juice factory in Tanzania that was producing no orange juice, just a shell, right? And in it, with the email, that this juice factory is supposed to process juice concentrate, but it does nothing. Right? It hasn't done anything. It lies idle. Right? That's the kind of information you can get from citizens, and you can learn a lot more about aid. But you need some way to motivate them to give the information. You need some way to gather it and present it to people in a useful way. And we hope aid data can do that. So this is an example. So the left column is the official information we have from the official sources. The right column is all the information that's given by concerned citizens, NGOs, other people close to the ground, and presumably that can be expanded, infinitely. The web scales beautifully. And we can have a lot more information about these projects. And we're working with Ushahidi, which is really quite an innovative group that is good at getting information from people's text messages on their cell phones and web to do those kinds of things. So. That's just kind of our general overview. Let me give the time now to Josh, and he's going to tell you about what we're doing. One of these specific projects is doing georeferencing, giving foreign aid addresses, specific addresses that people can use then to track and examine and scrutinize the aid.
Okay, as Dr. Nielsen mentioned, geocoding is one of our newer initiatives. We've been doing it for a little over a year. So I'll discuss it a little bit, and I'll focus a little more on the policy outcomes of it. And Dr. Findley will focus a little more on the potential research outcomes. So I'll start by going over the benefits. I'll discuss a little bit of the methodology and how we developed it, the experience with the World Bank over the summer, and then a little bit of the next steps for geocoding and how the data can be used. So geocoding allows you to track funds at a subnational level, and these funds can be not only tracked on their own, but they can also be matched up with subnational indicators such as poverty, infant mortality, other indicators of interest. And they allow stakeholders, researchers, donors to assess not only how well donors are coordinating, but also whether they're coordinating in ways that reach areas of greatest need. So these are the World Bank's current project locations in Nepal, and it looks like they're kind of scattered all over the country, and it looks like they're probably doing a pretty good job of targeting all areas of the country. But when you put on a poverty map, you can see that some of the areas, such as around the capital, receive a ton of aid, even though the need isn't as acute. And you see some of the areas with higher poverty, particularly in the Northeast and the Southwest, aren't receiving as much aid, and that the targeting isn't to the ground level as it should be. And when you look at it with population density, you can kind of see why. You can see that the aid projects are all clustering in areas of the highest population density, and that some of the more rural areas are somewhat missed. And as we've done some initial mapping in a number of countries, we've been able to see that this is quite often the case. It looks like, in the case of the World Bank and the African Development Bank, that they're keying more on population density than anything else. So Dr. Nielsen briefly mentioned crowdsourcing, and this is one of the things that we see as being a complementary output of geocoding. So crowdsourcing has been very effective in situations where there's an immediate dire need, such as the earthquakes in Haiti, political violence in Kenya, but there has never been a successful crowdsourcing initiative just for development when the need isn't quite as immediate. And part of the reason is that the information isn't as accessible to users as it could be and as it should be. And so in order to get ground level feedback from users and from stakeholders, it's important to provide ground level information to them. And so that's one of the things that geocoding can do. I mentioned earlier donor coordination, which is a huge problem. We're actually right now researching World Bank and African Development Bank coordination in several countries. And it kind of looks like they're kids playing soccer. They all cluster around the same areas. They all just want to touch the ball and get the credit of being on some of the larger projects. And that leaves a lot of the spatial financing gaps, such as what I showed in Nepal. This is another kind of example. This is a sectoral breakdown of the World Bank's project locations in DRC. So you can see along the East Kivu region that really only health and transportation seem to be major focuses, whereas some of the other sectors seem to be a little bit neglected. And you can also see that much of the country is missed by these projects, and they tend to target in specific areas, and again, largely in population-rich areas. So the actual methodology we developed in partnership with Uppsala University in Sweden. They had developed a methodology primarily for coding conflict locations, and one of their researchers began to adapt this for georeferencing aid projects, and we began working with them for a paper that Dr. Findley began working with them on, and kind of adapted the methodology with them. And then over the summer, through our work with the World Bank, we learned a lot of lessons on how to apply the methodology to going through hundreds of pages of project documents for individual projects, as opposed to just the short descriptions, which don't have nearly as rich information. So as I mentioned, we worked with the World Bank this past summer. We georeferenced about 2/3 of their overall project portfolio, and we're currently working to finish that up. And Mike will kind of show you what the data looks like and then go over a bit of a research application.
Okay, so this is a prototype we're developing with partners at ESRI, the company that produces ArcGIS, if any of you are familiar with Geographic Information Systems. We've developed a prototype here to try to understand better what's going on with the aid that is granted to various countries. And so we have a dynamic mapping system here. where we've got all the World Bank project locations for Africa, and we've just zoomed in for now on Kenya to show you a little bit of what's going on with Kenya and kind of the vision for how we could use this stuff in a real-world sense, right? And then also to facilitate academic research as well. So as you can see, this area here captures the country of Kenya, and each of these clustered tags here indicates the number of project locations for World Bank projects. Okay, so they're not all independent projects; they're independent project locations, right? So there could be more than one location per project. So somewhere in this circle, there's 27 project locations. As we zoom in, we can do this. Was running a bit slow earlier, but as we zoom in, we can, this will dynamically update and tell you sort of as you get closer and closer how many project locations are in each of these areas. So the 27 just turned into 8, 11, and somewhere else, and it's probably running a bit slow and not all showing up right away. But the idea here is to begin to try to visualize better and then be able to use this as visualize better the aid information, okay? But then be able to actually use this for real-world research, but also real-world policy and on-the-ground field work. So before we get to that, though, let me just say a little bit about what Josh mentioned earlier on Nepal. See, we can kind of visualize this a little bit in the context of Kenya as well. So if you look at Kenya and kind of look at the clustering of project locations, they really seem to cluster here in the southern corridor of Kenya. Okay, we sort of add up all these locations. Obviously, it's far higher than these locations up here. Okay, three locations here, 2 here. That happens to be a single project. That in this case, I believe, is an energy project. Okay, an agriculture project, and we can look at these in just a sec. But the key here is we can begin to ask questions like, why are there so many project locations in the southern corridor? Okay, and so we could overlay some subnational data on poverty. So here we have a measure of the percentage of the population under the national poverty line, where as the colors go from sort of light bluish up to brownish and reddish, it gets more, there's more and more poverty. Okay, so it's kind of interesting as we begin to overlay these things, and we see a similar pattern, I think, to Nepal, but actually I think it's more pronounced here in Kenya, that most of these projects are actually occurring in places where it's not as poor, right? And then we look at the population density map, and it almost looks like it's flipped, right? The poorest areas are also the least dense in terms of population, okay? And so it begins to make a little bit more sense, why all the project locations are going through sort of the southern corridor here, okay? And we have lots down in Mombasa on the coast. I'm not sure why those would all be there, but anyway, maybe aid workers like to make it to the coast occasionally, so. We can do other things, and this is where we want to actually take it into the field, be able to make it more usable in the field, is that you could actually use the map to code information. So thus far we run this giant coding operation, and we have lots of spreadsheets, and some of you know how this goes. Coding in spreadsheets is just really, really exciting. But we thought we would try to make it a little more scientific and boring, I guess, by actually interacting with a map here, where we can now input information directly into a map. And so the first step of this, maybe Josh can just click on an existing project so we can see information, and then I'll show you how we could just add information there. So here's a lot of the information that we have. So this is a prototype right now. This isn't all the information, but this is a lot of the information that we have for this particular project. We can link up to actual project documents here from the map, right? So a lot of information comes through on the map. So that's an existing project that might already be in there that we may have entered through the map or may have entered through a database, but we can now go in and actually enter data directly into the map, right? So we can choose an agriculture project, find a place for it there. We put in information, assign it a project ID and amounts and whatever else we need to there. And so this is useful, I think, from a coder perspective, because now we can visualize it, right? But this is tremendously useful now from the perspective of someone working within a donor organization, because now you can sit there as you're discussing the documents, right? I mean, as things are getting approved, you have a map in front of you, and you can say, okay, I know something's going to Mombasa. I just find it on the map, and I click, and I add, and I put in the information on there. In some cases, we may not know the exact location. Okay, maybe all you know is that. So you don't know, looking at a map, you're not sure where it would be, but you know you have a name of a city. Okay? So you could actually go in and enter, choose to do it by entering a city name. I believe it's the binoculars there. No, I think it's the binoculars there. Not all showing up. This is going to print us a book here, so we're going to get that. And now we can't see how to get this off.
Your printers here are now tied up for the next 5 hours.
There we go. Okay, I think it's the binoculars there. Okay, so now we can search against like a World Gazetteer just for a name, right? So whatever the name may be, and you might enter in something like Mombasa, and maybe one project would come up, one city would come up. It might be a list of cities, but you can then begin to adjudicate and differentiate sort of which city we're looking at here. Another way to do this is actually enter in the geographic coordinates. So you could actually just put in the latitudes and longitude, or the latitude and longitude for a particular location, which is tremendously useful if you've memorized all these things, right? No, I mean, the real value here now is you could actually take a mobile device out into the field, right? And you may know nothing else, right? You don't know a city name, you don't know, maybe in the middle of a field, right? You have no idea where it is, but if you can get a GPS location, and then somehow, even if you're not connected, I guess, you could enter this in to the system, right? And then once you get back into, web connection, right, it just uploads the geographic coordinate that you found from being out there. So you go find the juice factory, you stand there and get your GPS location, and it's just going to sync back up with the system. And so where we really want to go with this is to be able to take this and use it for field research. I mean, this could be tremendously useful to take pictures and get feedback, type up whatever you want. If you're not connected to the web, no problem. As long as you get connected at some point, this will all upload back into the central database and be rendered graphically in each of these maps here. I guess one final thing is it has some other functionality here, which is kind of cool. We have this tool here, it's sort of an editing tool, which will allow us to do things like tag roads. So it's unclear sometimes how do you geocode a road. It's easy if you have a point location. If you have the juice factory in Tanzania, right, that's one location. But if you have a road that gets put in, what do? Code every square, every foot of the road all the way up to, but what we can do with some of these editing tools is actually put in, say, like a beginning point and an end point, and then use the editing tool to sort of drag it all the way down the road, right? Or you could scale it some other way so that you could render something other than kind of point information. So, anything else we should say about this? Or that kind of covers most of what's there.
Filter by sector.
Yeah, you could filter by different sectors to see only agriculture, for example, or only the others. I guess the last thing is, so we've developed it such that we've got it on iPhone now. There's an app for everything, right? Really, seriously. Even stuff we're not going to use, no. But it's on the iPhone. We've got it on iPad. So one thing we're going to be doing in the next couple of months is going to Uganda and actually trying to test this system with an iPad device, right, and see how well it's working to sync everything back up and so forth. So anyway, so it's a nice, I think, visualization of the mapping for results data. But I think more importantly, I think it begins to show what the power of geocoded data really is. And debating whether I should give the Sven comment here. So one of our colleagues likes to tease us about geocoded data and say that it's not useful for much, and so he calls it geoporn. And you love to look at it, but there's not much there, right? And I think what this begins to show is that there's actually some real world uses for this, right? I mean, once you know project locations, you could actually go out into the field, you can track them down, you could crowdsource information. I think on the contrary, this is some of the most useful information that's coming out on foreign aid right now and on development finance generally. So let me say a little bit now about an application of some of the geocoded data. So I think they distributed a paper that we did on analyzing the subnational relationship between foreign aid and violent armed conflict. And the research puzzle from an empirical or from a data perspective is really that we have these databases that are at the project level. So aid data, which Professor Nielsen described, the OECD CRS database at the project level, and yet you look at all the research studies that use these databases, and all of them throw away project information and aggregate back up to the country level, right? And so the question is, excuse me, why not use the project level information? And you know, there's probably a variety of reasons for why we haven't done this, but I think geocoding is one reason. We haven't known where they've been going, and so it's harder to sort of deal with that information at a project level, especially statistically, which all of the economists like to do. Actually, that's not fair. Political scientists as well, right? We all do this stuff. So, and then, you know, on the other hand, so most of my training has been in actually security studies, and the literature in security studies is also increasingly showing that conflict is location specific. So there's interesting studies of like natural resources and conflict, and they show that, you know, in some cases diamonds or oil may motivate conflict. And so we have these nice cross-country regressions of this, but then you go look at a few cases and it begins to raise questions. Chechnya, or Russia, I should say. If you look at the study of Russia, natural resources and conflict, right? There are natural resources in Russia, and how close are they to Chechnya? There's an oil pipeline that goes through that's not terribly useful anymore, but, you know, a lot of the other resources are out in Siberia, right? But these sort of the national level shows up Russia is a positive correlation between natural resources and conflict, and yet there's really not much of a relationship there. And so geocoding at the conflict level, getting small areas like Chechnya, and then geocoding the aid or the resources makes a lot of sense from this perspective. So what do we learn about aid and conflict? If you look at sort of some of the expectations that are in the conflict literature, the aid and conflict literature, they suggest a few different things. I think like every other literature, right? Is there a literature where there's consensus? But, you know, there are arguments that aid actually makes civil war more likely to occur. There's arguments that aid makes conflict less likely to occur, but they're all at the national level. And so we tried to look at what some of the expectations are, what some of these expectations are in the literature. One of them was that aid increases the prize of capturing the state. Okay, so if enough foreign aid is flowing to a government, does the government then, you know, if rebels can capture the government, do you get access to all that aid at that point? Okay. Others have suggested that maybe it's a rebellion of business logic, okay, that you rebel in order to actually just get access to aid flows, which suggests that it doesn't matter about capturing the state itself, you're capturing specific locations of aid, right? If there's an aid project that goes in and the aid project creates something particularly useful to society, maybe rebels would want to control something like that. So from our and maybe there's other mechanisms here, indirect growth effects or moral hazard, and we could go into some of those, but we won't now. But as we look at these, the first one looks particularly amenable to like a country level study. You might look at a country and see if rebels are trying to take over the state. But a rebellion as business logic suggests that maybe you're going to go after specific locations within countries. Okay? If aid, especially fungible aid, so aid that can be appropriated for other purposes, right? If that goes to a specific location, if the rebels take that location, they can get access to that aid, right? And so it suggests that subnationally we might be able to understand a little bit more about whether aid is motivating battles or motivating violence. How am I on time? Good. Okay. So research design, we geocoded data on aid projects occurring within African countries from 1989 to 2007. We did this to look at during conflict dynamics primarily. For now, the goal is to do more. We have more detailed data on Angola. We essentially coded everything for Angola, Sierra Leone, and Mozambique in the aid data database. So we have all projects pre-conflict, during conflict, and post-conflict. And then we combine these data with conflict zones, terrorism, and battle data to be able to begin to visualize whether they clustered together in any form. So let me just talk through quickly a couple of examples, and then we could field questions about any of these if you're interested. So if you just look at the locations of foreign aid battles and terrorist events in Angola for the period 1989 to 2004. This is not the full period of the war, okay? It obviously began earlier. But this is kind of the distribution. And so what we've done here is put the terrorist events in red, scaled them by the size in terms of how many people died in the terrorist event. These concentric circles inside suggest that multiple events occurred. So in this case, we have one very large event and then a series of smaller events in this particular location. And then we take battle data from the Uppsala Conflict Database and also do the same thing, which is what you see here in yellow. So each of these smaller dots here are smaller battles that occurred throughout the war. And then everything in blue represents an A project. Okay? And so you have multiple A projects, as you can see from the concentric circles. And the size is scaled by the number of dollars. And can't really, it's difficult to see the legend here in this picture. But that gives you some sense of like what the clustering begins to look like here. Right? That there is some clustering. And I want to be careful to note that we're not claiming there's a causal relationship here at this point, but begins to open up possibilities for how we might analyze this. And so let me show briefly just one quick visualization to bring this to life a bit more. So here we progressively layer year by year, so you can try to get a sense of whether on a yearly basis there's clustering. So 1989, you first have, these are the different battle events in 89. We just added a terrorist event that occurs, and then here are the aid locations. Move to 1990. Again, first the battle locations in 1990. Add a couple of terrorist events in 1990. And then you see foreign aid project commitments in the same year. Again, battles, terrorist events, similar location, and then where foreign aid is committed for the year. Okay, I'm not going to go through all this, but I want to give you a sense of kind of how we begin trying to reason through some of what's here. Let me put up just a few quick maps, and we'll close up here. So for Angola, one particular thing we did in the paper that hopefully some of you saw was to try to separate out aid into different types of aid. So we separated out into fungible aid versus non-fungible aid. The expectation being that if rebels are going to capture some of the aid, they're probably going to be able to capture fungible aid easier than non-fungible aid. And so we just tried to map these where we lagged aid. So we have aid for 1990 and 1991. And then we have battles a year or 2 years later, just to see if battles followed in the year or two after aid was committed to these locations. Okay? There's lots of, we're after correlations here. We're not suggesting that for sure aid is precipitating conflict. But we're interested in whether these subnational geocoded data tell us anything. So as we look at this, here's the fungible aid, and I'll just compare these two for a minute, like the battles and the fungible aid. We can look and see that fungible aid is granted to all these different locations here. And then as we compare up the battles, it looks like there's overlap here in terms of a battle occurs here, aid is granted here, okay? Battles here, aid here, battles in this area, aid in this area. There's also some overlap with some of the non-fungible aid as well, but clearly there's clustering going on, even if we lag aid and conflict here a little bit. So at least suggestive that there may be something going on. Mozambique, very quickly, this shows 1989 to 1992, kind of the general clustering that takes place. It's a bit difficult to see, I'm sorry. This is 89-90 foreign aid commitments. So, but if we look at this here, we can see some of the foreign aid commitments. Here's some circles, here, 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 along the coast. And we see battles. This actually occurs in the precise location of where the aid is granted, all the way down to the village level. This one right here is also in the exact same location. Some battles here that match up with these aid locations. And I forgot to say in Angola, a number of them actually, the battles occurred in the precise villages where the aid was committed. So not in all cases, but at least in some. So suggestive that at least these battles are following where the aid is committed in many cases. And then down in the capital of Mozambique, there's some overlap as well. One final one quickly. This is when the war begins in Sierra Leone, and if you remember what takes place here, the RUF invades from Liberia, right? And so you see the clustering of battles in the southeast corner of Sierra Leone at the beginning of the war, and yet here are the aid locations, okay, in the center and the west part of the country. And so early on there seems to be kind of no connection here at all, perhaps just because of the invasion. And then as the war progresses, we see much more of the battles end up being in a lot of places where aid is located. This could be a function of a lot of things, right? I mean, it could just be that they're moving westward, right? Well, were they after the aid or not? It's difficult to say, right? But it goes back to the mechanism of are you after is it rebellion as business, or is it are you trying to capture the state, right, so that you could get access to all these aid rents? And it's possible that's what's going on, is they're sort of moving for those particular to gain access to those particular resources and the government. Again, I'm not trying to claim that we have causal relationships here, we've identified any of that, but I think what this is at least suggestive of is that subnational data begins to help us unpack an otherwise pretty difficult question here of aid and conflict at a national level. We begin to get at least more clues, and we could go further. We actually initially put in like some statistical measures here, doing some hotspot analysis and other things, which reviewers told us to axe from the paper. So those will come at a later date. But we actually want to get more systematic about trying to understand whether there's a connection here. Let me just close and say, it looks like there appears to be some sort of relationship. Maybe it's a weak relationship, but certainly something in need of investigating further. And and there may be other factors going on here as well, such as population density, as we saw in the cases of looking at Nepal and Kenya and other things. And so I'll go ahead and I'll wrap up here, but again, just sort of want to kind of tie together everything that we suggested in the sense that we think geocoded data is kind of the key to doing a lot of different things here. I think in terms of research, it helps us answer a lot of the old questions, and also it helps us ask and answer new questions. But it also facilitates real policy work here in the sense that people can go on the ground and actually try to track down some of these projects and get citizen feedback and empower the beneficiaries of the aid. And there certainly a variety of other contexts in which we could use this. So, go ahead and quit there.
The number of projects that have been reported in aid data, how that was different from existing databases before aid data was ever there. And the level of detail that you captured in aid data that we did not have before in any existing database. Just so we know just what the impact of this database is.
Sure. There are about 1 million project records in aid data. About 800,000 of those came from the OECD. So that is the OECD's excellent work over many years. And most of that, of course, comes from the OECD sends a survey every year to governments. They're supposed to fill out about all of their foreign aid. So under treaty, they're obligated to do that. But the rest came from our pestering the different aid organizations. The multilateral organizations are great because they just publish their annual reports with all of their projects in it. The countries like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait sometimes publish as well, but many of the other countries, a lot of Eastern European countries, Brazil, China, we had to go to them and ask them for their information, and they were gracious enough to give it to us. In terms of the number of projects we've added, it's 100,000, or so. In terms of the number of dollars, it's almost doubling the amount that's available for systematic tracking. In terms of the number of donors, it's almost double. So we've added a bunch of donors that were missing.
I think 45 donors have been added.
45, yeah. So it's
a non-trivial number.
Yeah. So and most of this is just someone paying attention. With this much money going, you'd think that other people would pay attention, and they can now. I think it's a little easier, but it was a huge undertaking. This is millions of dollars from the Gates and Hewlett Foundation, the National Science Foundation to make this happen. So and I think they deserve a lot of the credit for seeing a need and being willing to give the money to obscure scholars at College of William and Mary and Brigham Young University, not exactly to academic hotspots generally, but high quality institutions nonetheless. So
And the level of detail that you get in aid data, I mean, what strikes me as most potential for the system is the activity coding that you're now doing, where we can actually start to distinguish not whether any project is for health or education, but what specific kind of health project, what specific kind of education project. So as policy students, we want to know what the effect of aid is on any particular socioeconomic outcome. We can do so with much more detail and certainty than we ever could before.
Yeah, we found that the OECD had a pretty elaborate sector coding system with 200 or so different sectors. But as we tried to apply that same coding schema to all of the multilateral projects, we found that there were lots of categories that were ambiguous, and some categories that were sort of omnibus categories, where lots of things got dumped, especially all of the multi-sector projects. We were like, you know, we need a more fine-grained instrument here. So we came up with 800 different categories of activities. So it gives a lot more granularity in sort of the what is this project actually doing, and importantly, a given project can do more than one thing. So rather than just get lumped into a multi-sector category, it can be for multiple different activities, and some projects have dozens of activities. Now, I mean, unfortunately, we don't have budget breakdown, so we can break out how much the project went to each activity, but we do have a sense of what the projects are doing now with much more detail. Useful for those of you interested in doing this kind of work.
Do you examine where the foreign currency ends up? So the foreign aid is in dollars or pounds or something like that, and that doesn't get to a village. That gets to central bank or a national budget, or when you talk about the location of a foreign aid project, it kind of mystifies me. My information is 40 years out of date when I was in the foreign aid program in Colombia. Colombia needed foreign exchange very badly, and to import machine tools and so forth, and we gave it that. Now that machine purchaser put his local currency into a pot. That created some resources for projects. And congressmen visiting were very interested in where those projects were. And so we would go out and put up signs on projects that we thought would impress the congressman about that was a foreign aid project supported by the United States government. They ordered everybody smiled. We were really just as much interested in where the public health activities in Colombia were that were financed with their own resources. And so if in the map of Nepal and where foreign aid projects are located, seems to me not so interesting as a map of where all health projects are located. We used our influence on the total loan package to require them to pay attention to the entire distribution of their health centers, not just the ones that had U.S.-funded aid on it. Your whole project seems to me to be based on this sort of identifying a specific foreign aid-funded project at the local level. Well, maybe. Not my experience.
That is a great comment, and honestly, I have not thought about tracking currency flows, which is really hard to do, right? But I think your general point about what are the governments doing, and money is fungible. I think one of the reasons why tracking currencies is so hard. And is foreign aid displacing government activity? Is it augmenting government activity? Right? Is it shifting? Right? From one emphasis to the other. One of the nice things about our partners, Development Gateway, is they sponsor or they manage a set of what they call aid management platforms in 20 or so countries, where the governments keep track of all the information about foreign aid and presumably anything else they'd like to include, at local levels and at different levels, layers of bureaucracy. And so, yes, eventually we want to be able to track, how aid has effects on all of the other areas of government budgets. Of course, the first step, of course, is keeping track of the aid itself, which hasn't been done. Right? And then, we have to rely on governments to keep track of the rest, and then hope we can merge that information. But I think, what you're suggesting is absolutely right. Sometimes we live in a world with too much information. How do we find it all and manage it all, and then see the effects of one sector on another? That's hard.
And I would just add that we have actually thought about this a great deal. The problem is we don't have the tools to deal with it yet. I mean, the system that Professor Nielsen described is one system, but in terms of the way we're coding the aid projects, we attach a set of precision codes to each of these projects. And so money that goes through a national government, we mark it as such in the data, right? At this point, we can't track exactly how it all flows through, but we mark it as such so that if we could get access to these governments, right, through the aid management platform or something else, we could actually we would know which projects to begin tracing through the system, right? Many projects are designed for local areas. They don't go at all through the national government. I mean, a lot of what you see here, it's a road, it's a clinic, it's a school, it's other things that really are localized, right? And we can attach a precision code to all those as well and know that they're local, but the national government ones, we recognize that there's this whole process, but we, for now we can just attach sort of a precision code to say, we can't deal with this right now, but we would like to, and potentially a government could help unpack some of this stuff at some point. So I think we would definitely like to and are aware of it.
Yeah, and just to add a bit more, in recent talks with actual Ministry of Finance members, they've actually been asking us, well, where are these aid finance projects? Because it's estimated that about 60% of foreign aid is off budget currently. And so the actual Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Planners, they want to know where donors are working in their countries when they're not working through the central government.
They get pretty frustrated. I mean, imagine if, you have all these foreigners that are doing things in your country and you don't even know what they're doing. So I mean, it's not uncommon for them to plan and manage the construction of a health clinic only to find out that there is one being planned and constructed by foreign aid in the same location. They could have used that money somewhere else, but they don't even know. Right? There's a lot of mess in foreign aid, right? Which a little better, with better information, might help resolve.
So I recently visited the NGO board in Kampala, and they gave me their database of registered non-governmental organizations, which is not by any means all of them, right? 8,000 NGOs listed for in Uganda on their official registered roles there. They give us the Excel spreadsheet. So I scanned through quickly the email columns. Probably about 1% of the records actually had an email address attached to it. And most of them had a physical address, but in many cases, even the physical address was kind of spotty, right? And so we had a discussion. This was the top person over NGO affairs, and this person said, we have no idea what's going on with these NGOs. We have no way to sort of track what they're doing. We don't know if they're still operating or not. We don't know where they're getting their money from. It was just complete darkness, right? I mean, they were completely in the dark, right? They just had no idea what was going on, and so I think the goal is to try to move further and further to capture this information, but it's going to take time.
This gentleman back here? Yes.
Yeah, thank you. My name is John Enko. I'm an MPAC student from Ghana. I think my fundamental concern has been touched on, which is about the way you got the data. I was the national coordinator of aid effectiveness in Ghana, and I'm glad to note that you work with OECD to generate some data. We were their anchor organization in terms of civil society organizations in Ghana. As a matter of fact, I coordinated the International Aid Conference, which took part in Ghana, which came up in Ghana in 2008. The fundamental question has always been how to generate this data. If you work from the reverse side, in other words, if you work from the bottom and you want to generate this data, I tell you, you're going to get stuck. But thank God that you guys rather work with the aid organizations and got that. Now, the critical concern over here has to do with how do you empower the organizations that you are mentioning on the ground to be able to do that. But I guess that is somewhat above your jurisdiction. We were supported by Oxfam. I met one of their staff here and we were just talking about some of those things. They supported us to go down to the ground to just conduct a simple survey, working with the community people themselves. Because if you, for instance, provide aid for a health facility, let's say a health center, it is the community people who will be the best, to identify the health facility and help in these kinds of jobs. But here's the case, the community people do not even know where the funding for the project is coming from. There was a scenario we found, which was, there was a school that was being built with aid funds, IMF and another organization. What we found was that the two organizations put, how do you call it, signboard or signpost, I don't know how you call it here. The two organizations put the signpost by the school, and this highlighted the concern you just addressed. So I'm looking at how we can use this important breakthrough that you are doing, to get the aid organization to understand that, look, from the ground to be able to do this is difficult. How do you empower civil society organizations to be able to hold their government, to this responsibility? Until we do this, we will only be scratching the surface, because we just went to the sources and got this data. But on the ground, I can stretch out my neck to tell you that this is going to be a very difficult job, because I got stuck working through a network, a structural, a hierarchical system with civil society-based organizations on the ground, and we didn't go halfway.
This is a very, very important area, and thank you for the comment. So this summer in Uganda, we're working with Ushahidi, this web-based technology organization, organization, whatever. Yeah.
Are you guys familiar with anyone familiar with Ushahidi?
Take a look online. They do some really cool stuff. They're the ones that track the violence in Kenya and earthquake disaster relief in Haiti by having citizens text information on their cell phone. And so, but what they don't know, and Josh was talking about this, what they don't know is what motivates citizens to text message, right? And so we're trying out lots of different incentives, and we're doing it in the context of a randomized controlled trial, sort of a field experiment where we've randomized the different incentives to different locations. And we're trying things like paying people to send a text message.
Minutes on their phone.
Yeah, giving them minutes on their phone, putting their names in the newspaper, or having them spoken on the radio, having competitions between villages about who provides the best information on the aid projects that are there. We have no idea what motivates people to give us information, but we know that until we get it, we're going to be blind on the ground. And unfortunately, they are also blind because they don't even know where those projects are. So and unless you start from somewhere, in this case with the donors, and say, this is where the donors think the projects are, let's go check. Right, and so hopefully we can, using both from the ground up and from the top down, we should get better information. But this is a long process. We're just now starting.
And not without problems. We're aware of the fact that it's going to be difficult to try to extract some of this information in many cases. So, but Ushahidi had tremendous success in Kenya following the post-election violence. They publicized where people could text message, and they got a huge response. In Haiti, they also got a huge response. But they went to the DRC, and they decided to try this in eastern DRC. They figured lots of bad things going on there as well, right? Perhaps worse than Haiti and Kenya, depending on how you look at it. And they tried to get people to crowdsource information in eastern DRC, and guess what? It failed. They got almost nothing, right? And their initial reaction from that was, as I understand it at least, was you kind of need a crisis to get people to actually engage the process. And so, if there's death, rape, violence, and everything else in Eastern Congo, and you can't get people to crowdsource information, that poses some serious tasks to get people, I think, or some serious challenges in terms of getting people to crowdsource information about a school or something, right? And so it'll be difficult, but I think we've identified a set of set of incentive structures here that we can try to test out all the different possibilities, and we may find at the end of the day that none of them work, but that would be useful information, I think. And we may find that one or two of them work, and that would be even more useful. So I mean, we'll see how it goes.
And y'all, you hear about reviews on Yelp, for example, of people sort of crowdsource information, but it's like the competitor trying to take down another business, and so there's not always accurate information. And the other side of for y'all, because we had Patrick Meyer, Confluent co-founders, involved talking about how do you know if the information is at all accurate, even in a Haitian context. And so maybe you triangulate with multiple sources, but just the bandwidth for people on the other side, those were extraordinary moments in which they were able to sort of mobilize the student volunteer community in a way that maybe there were fewer incentives for inaccurate reporting because it was a crisis moment. But you could, aside from the issue of at what point do you get incentives for people to misreport, and there's also the other side in which the government may want to take advantage of the sort of NGO information that then shut them down for, they represent dissident groups or whatever, and this becomes another means by which, governments that don't have the best of intentions then are able to use this for malign purposes. So maybe you could speak to both the sort of incentives for misreporting and, governments who might do bad things with this information.
Yeah, I mean, the old adage, knowledge is power, right? Another way to say that is information is political. So it's not, this is not, there is some objective truth out there, right, and we're just going to get at it. I think that the best way we do that in science is by trying it lots of different ways and getting lots of different, takes on the same bit of information. And so I think there's the possibility that we can triangulate a little bit. And whenever I'm trying to buy a product on Amazon.com, I'm very careful to look at the reviews, right, and think, okay, how might these be biased? And and I think the same thing, if we get enough people engaged, could if we were able to have users rate each other on how good their information is, we might be able to sort out some of the bad stuff. But it's again, that needs to be crowdsourced too. I mean, it makes me, I wonder, how does Wikipedia work? Right, or Linux, these massive crowdsourced projects. Well, they've got lots of people willing to do it for free, and then they've got pretty good, information filtering mechanisms to make sure that the information that does get in there is higher quality. And we're still learning how to do any of this, but it's hard, especially because it's so political, right? Any ideas, Mike?
Well,
He's the
I think
idea guy, so.
I actually think this is a worse problem if we're dealing with like crises, right, where you have to have an immediate response. We have, there's a development project going in or it's going up. There's plenty of time for self-correction in the system as well, right? And so I think if you get misinformation, there's at least the opportunity for other users to then crowdsource correct information and try to balance it out. And at the end of the day, there's probably not all extremely consequential feedback, I guess, that comes from this for sort of like, short-term decisions. I could be off on this, but I think is the way we conceptualize these development projects. We kind of just interested in general information about is it really going up, right? Are they really using the resources they're supposed to? And there's time, I think, for the self-correction process in the system to occur. On the government issue, I think that, the hope is that, there's also self-correction built into the system as well, in the sense that NGOs could also provide information that could correct if governments are misusing these information channels, that NGOs and citizens could also have a forum to provide information in an anonymous way, I guess. So foolproof, no. Problematic, sure. But we'll move along and figure this out. So this is one reason we partnered with Ushahidi, is because they've thought through a lot of these issues in a lot of detail, and so we hope that they'll be able to help deal with some of them.
The way this works in places where we looked at it more extensively is that there are reputation effects to providing information, right? And if you get labeled quickly as someone who provides bad information, well, then you get ignored. And so there are incentives to provide better information, which are not, they're not absolute, right? And they're not foolproof. But I think they're over time with enough sources, you can sort out, the worst parts.
My biggest fear is that we have the opposite problem. It's not a misinformation problem, it's a no information problem. So
I'm worried about that.
I just want to see information come in, right, and then we deal with the second issue of how do we filter it all. So
yeah, I'm worried you think about it, when you go to Amazon.com, you're trying to buy something, or iTunes or whatever, there's so few reviews, right? certainly thousands of people have bought this product, but only, you know, dozens have bothered to write a review, and they're the most opinionated ones, right? The ones that are really confident about their own opinions, and it's like, that may not be the best information. So how do you provide a better representative sample of people who have information, and how do you motivate those folks? That's really hard.